What if I told you one of my favorite top laners to play right now was actually Lillia? With a kit built for full clearing jungler and impacting teamfights, who would think about throwing her into the top lane? Well, me, and I think that Lillia is actually an incredible sleeper pick in the top lane that you should consider picking up yourself. Her kit, although designed for the jungle, brings some incredible creature comforts that can be appreciated from the north side of the rift. So much so that I would actually recommend picking her over some of your favorite top lane champions that you may know and love. This video aims to help you better understand the strengths of this pick, things to look out for when playing it, and hopefully convince you to add it to your champion pool. Here's a quick breakdown of how we'll be going over the video. I'll touch on general concepts of Lillia Top's champion identity and what success looks like in games that you are doing well on her. We'll then discuss different components of her kit and how we can work better to optimize each one of these. This includes going over different matchups, rune optimizations, ability maxing, your build, pathing, and how to play out each phase of the game. Let's start by explaining the pick overall and what it's all about. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to like and sub for more content like this. At a high level, I tend to describe Lillia Top as Aatrox's dear-blooded AP cousin. Some of the same strengths about Lillia jungle still apply here. She's excellent at front to back, slower fights, and does a great job at creating space as a pseudo frontliner for her team. She also does excellently when she gets a lot of resources, because doing so allows her to gain a ton of damage and lets her get away with very aggressive play in team fights. Her power curve is also similar to Aatrox in the fact that she spikes in the mid game, but I'd say that Lillia scales harder than Aatrox thanks to the incredible amount of percent damage that she brings to the table. Let's start things off by discussing some of the biggest changes that happen when you play Lillia Top versus traditionally having her in the jungle. We now have to go from viewing Lillia's kit from the lens of a jungler and now start to think about how her kit can interact and influence some of the top lane pool right now. For those of you familiar with Lillia jungle, she actually does not have many bad matchups at all. When she was good, many teams would easily blind pick her in the jungle because there weren't many champions that could punish her very hard. The same case sort of applies here, as Lillia's matchup spread in top lane is actually pretty solid. Speaking in overall terms, she pretty much stomps every single tank in the game thanks to her percent damage. Champions like Ornn, Sion, Shen, Tahm Kench all fall before her because they're all relatively slow champions, and Lillia can also fight favorably against them at all stages in the game. In the early game, Lillia's relatively low damage output means that they have some agency, but as soon as Lillia picks up Liandry's or hits level 9, it becomes much harder for these champions to catch up against her because of her increased movement speed and dueling capability. A unique but similar case actually occurs when Lillia faces Juggernaut champions. While Lillia doesn't inherently stat check these champions by any means, these champions don't have enough lockdown to actually punish her enough in the early game. It sounds crazy to say, but Lillia does not match up that poorly to normal lane bullies like Darius and Mordekaiser for this reason. If the situation gets tough, Lillia can pretty much just run away. The main threat in this case, however, is that if the Lillia player messes up the early game and fails to stabilize, then these champions can itemize enough and utilize their leads to make sure that Lillia dies before she can run. Trades against these champions will still be rough in the early game, as you would imagine, so you still have to show them the same amount of respect and care in these lanes as you would as other champions in these same matchups. Against fighters and high mobility top laners, this is where Lillia might have the most fear in lane. Much like Aatrox, Lillia has the most fear against champions with a high amount of all-in potential and mobility. Lillia loves elongated, drawn-out fights that allow her to play in her own comfort zone, so champions that attempt to invade that space and engage on her can cause her some trouble. So some of her worst matchups in this case are champions like Aurelia and Akali, who can resolve their all-in combos around preventing Lillia from getting away. Other champions in this class like Camille and Fiora also give her trouble, but to a slightly lesser degree, because Lillia can actually typically outlast the attempted all-ins from champions like this. Because of this, depending on the meta she's in, and based on the relative viability of the jungle Lillia alongside top Lillia, I can see this champion being picked as a blind top laner in certain metas like the durability one we've been seeing, or as a hard punishing counter pick if the enemy presents a good matchup for it. This, in combination with her ability to be a flex pick, allows her to be picked in any slot in the first phase on either side, or as a great counter pick in slots like R3 and R5. Since Lillia is also relatively versatile in the terms of the way she plays out team fights, this also contributes to her ability to be blinded in many scenarios and allows her to be picked in many team compositions. Moving on to runes. So your most common rune of choice here will be Conqueror, thanks to its ability to grant a ton of stats during extended trades. With a combination of consistently using her Q and other abilities, as well as weaving in auto attacks, it typically won't be that long until Lillia is able to fully stack it. On top of a fully stacked Conqueror granting healing on all the damage that Lillia deals, the increased AP that it will give her also increases her own healing on her passive. Her other runes are meant to supplement this style and effectively just contribute to her high sustain during combat. To follow up on Conqueror, Lillia can go Presence of Mind, Legend Tenacity, and any of the last row precision runes depending on the enemy team composition. To follow up on this, Lillia Top has a few secondary options as well, depending on what she needs. A Resolve tree would probably be the most consistent, as it enables options such as Conditioning Revitalize or Conditioning Unflinching. She can also take runes like Bone Plating in a pinch against volatile matchups that can threaten her safety in the early game. Champions like Aurelia can even become much more palatable when you can play around with runes like Bone Plating. In addition, Lillia can honestly also opt to go into other trees such as Sorcery or Inspiration as well. Sorcery can be great because it unlocks runes like Celerity and Gathering Storm, whereas Inspiration can give her access to free stopwatch or boots and things like Cosmic Insight. These would be options for more aggressive matchups in case of the sorcery tree, in which you can afford more damage, and Inspiration in specific matchups where you'll need to rely on your summoner spells more, or if your build just requires you to rely on your runes to upfront the stopwatch. If you just want something that's consistently good every game, I'd probably run the Conqueror set with a Resolve secondary tree for the best results. For your items, I'd say that Lillia also follows a similar path when playing top lane as she does when speccing out for the jungle. In terms of starting items, Doran's Ring will be your bread and butter because of its ability to synergize with your passive, much like Presence of Mind. If Lillia hits even a single ability, she presents a huge amount of uptime for Doran's Ring, granting Lillia much more mana than the average champion. On any HP champion, I also always recommend picking up Darkseal when you can. For the stats you get, it pretty much always becomes insanely gold efficient for what it is, and the 350 price tag is so low that it's pretty easy to forgive a lot of the time. Lillia also still loves Liandry's as her mythic of choice. It's a pretty well-rounded item that just adds so much more oomph and dot damage to every ability that she uses. When in matchups that you can afford it, it's also ideal to build Demonic Embrace alongside that, and you'll effectively have your bread and butter items to set yourself up for the rest of the game. One thing with Lillia top that I see more commonly when compared to her normal builds is that she has to worry somewhat about her mana reliance depending on the type of fight she's partaking in. So a very common second item take on her is Frozen Heart, as the cooldowns greatly increase her uptime in terms of her Q, cuts away from her mana problems, and allows her to completely curb AD matchups. Zhonya's will also do the trick if you need that burst of survivability of team fights as well. By this point, you'll have to worry about picking up your boots of choice. Lillia loves to get Lucidity boots because she has very high effectiveness with summoner spells, and the more things she can access to lower her cooldowns, the more annoying she gets. Being able to stack up her passive movement speed and keep that up easily in a fight is the point where Lillia starts to have less and less counterplay against the enemy team. In cases where dealing a lot of burst damage is important, or in cases where Lillia top will be the primary source of AP on your team, you can also pick up Sorc Shoes to supplement this style. From here, you have a lot of item choices to think about, and these will primarily come from whatever creature comforts you're looking for, as well as continuing to answer whatever blockers the enemy has. Things like Rabadons and Cosmic Drive are great for just emphasizing the strengths Lillia already has, while where Lillia can also even afford to purchase some tank items if her role on the team is to serve more as a frontliner. Deadman's Plate, Force of Nature, and even items like Thornmail can be things to consider here as well. Lillia is also very flexible in that she can pick up some of the AP heavier versions of these defensive items too. So items like Banshees can work really well against ability heavy team compositions, and Rylai's can be good as an overall AP item if you need a combination of offense and defense. Lillia is pretty unique in that she can viably access a lot of items in the shop, so feel free to take full advantage of that. Touching on combos and ability usage, Lillia admittedly isn't that combo heavy of a champion, and the fact that she's generally easy to pick up in this sense makes her pretty simple to pick up and be effective with. However, there are some light combos with things like her ultimate that are helpful to have, as well as good usage tips overall with her. Using your E to proc a slow in order to set up your W and Q sweet spots is an example of this, so doing E and Q or EWQ are two pretty decent combos. The main combos per se that Lillia can use revolve around cycling your cooldowns at just the right time before your ultimate ticks off. Since your sleep actually CCs the enemy for a fair amount of time, this is a great time for you to catch up on your cooldowns. Now sure, getting free time to get your cooldowns back is great and all, but how is this practical in an actual skirmish? Depending on when you use your ultimate, you can potentially have all three of your basic abilities on CD, and since your Q is generally on a 4-second cooldown to begin with, if you for example get a Q right off before the sleep actually starts, you won't break the sleep and you'll have full time to get that Q cooldown cycled through so you can pop whatever champions are affected by it. You don't even have to wait for a whole nother Q to come up when it happens as well. The biggest burst combo Lillia arguably has comes from using her W to break the sleep, as its sweet spot has the highest increase in damage and is also the harder one to hit when compared to her Q. Getting the sweet spot W in combination with popping sleep will typically result in a huge chunk of damage and the ability to one-shot most opponents outright, especially since you'll be able to hit a free E and Q as well. I know it sounds like a lot to absorb all at once, but you don't really have to overthink it. The rule of thumb here is that if you want to proc your sleep, just blow whatever abilities you have available in the period before that sleep duration begins, and this provides you more efficiency on your cooldowns. Quickly touching on team fights, as Lillia, you're going to be the one that's pulling the trigger and getting things going in your fights. Your sleep is such an insane team fighting tool that if you hit at least 3 targets with your Q and get a good angle going, you're basically guaranteed to get a great team fight as long as your team has the appropriate follow-up. Since Lillia is a fairly squishy champion though, you have to play around the idea that you can get one shot, so you have to be really tricky with the angles that you're going for. Use your flash super aggressively to get a good angle off and then save yourself with either stopwatch or Zhonya's. Immediately after, you should make the decision to either follow up or run away depending on how the fight is going. If you do need to run, you'll have a lot of movement speed ramped up from your Q at this point, so you can look to re-enter the fight and pick off any stragglers. The entire strength of Lillia in fights is the amount of targets you'll be able to get down with the sleep, so it's very essential that you'll be able to maximize the amount that you hit. So it's actually very essential that you hit as many as possible. You also don't always have to look for the sick flash 9-man sleep all the time, because your E is a great way to look for picks as well. It does have a decent AoE, so if you aim it on the wave or if the enemy team is somewhat clumped, they could be taken aback as you go for a long range sleep instead. Overall, Lillia top lane takes some of the greatest strengths we know and love about Lillia and retrofits her to become a very oppressive, very fun top laner to have. She actually carries some very unique and rewarding aspects to her kit that add some spice to top lane matchups, and I find her a very fun addition to the top lane pool overall. It's one of my spicier takes that I think can be a really great asset to have in the right environment, and I hope to see some teams potentially pick it up in the future. Anyways, that's it from me. I hope to catch you in the next one. Stay fresh.